Good afternoon, and welcome to the first in a series of 3 conversations convened by Young Invincibles to focus on the quickly and dramatically changing workforce landscape for young adults in the United States. I'm Kyle Southern, and I serve as Policy and Advocacy Director for Higher Education and Workforce at YI, where our mission is to empower young adults economically and promote their civic engagement. We, of course, have these conversations in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic that continues across the country. At least 138,000 Americans have now lost their lives to COVID-19, leaving behind communities devastated by their losses. The pandemic's requirement for social distancing has also inflicted incalculable damage on the American economy and put many more lives into personal and financial upheaval. The financial crisis in 2008 was also a sharp turning point in US history. Original research by Young Invincibles 10 years after the Great Recession showed that for the first time, young adults who graduated from college with student debt had negative net wealth. Home ownership among young people continues to trend downward, and the financial decline that has been especially devastating for all young people has been devastating for Black Americans regardless of student debt. Young adults, especially those without a college degree, are particularly vulnerable in recessions. They are new to the job market with little on-the-job experience or seniority to protect them from layoffs. A large body of research, along with the experience of those who have come of age in the last year, shows that young people trying to start their careers in the economic crisis are at a lasting disadvantage. Their wages, opportunities, and confidence in the workplace are difficult to recover. In the wake of the COVID crisis, we are again facing another recession squarely in the face, just as some young people are beginning to recover from the last recession. Youth unemployment now stands at a staggering 25%. While the last few years were largely good ones for Americans who were already doing well economically, their growing wealth did little to help put millennials or younger people on a solid financial foundation. Today, our panel discussion reflects on the systems that were not working and how state and federal agencies can provide a stronger framework for young people during and beyond a recession. We're joined by Erica Cuevas, Senior Policy Manager at Jobs for the Future, Melissa Johnson, State Strategies Director at the National Skills Coalition, and Toni Symonds, Chief Consultant for the Committee on Jobs, Economic Development, and the Economy in the California Legislature. That committee is chaired by Assemblymember Cervantes, who represents California's 60th legislative district. As you listen to these conversations, please make use of the Q&A button on your screen to submit a question for any or all of our speakers. A member of YI's team will be monitoring those questions and identifying several to pose in the closing segment of our program. Please also keep an eye and send your responses for a few poll questions on your screen as well. And please join our conversation by using the hashtag #WorkforceReimagined. First, however, Young Invincibles is fundamentally an organization seeking to put the voice of students and young adults at the forefront of policy decisions. To frame our program, I'll turn it over to Christine Mompoint, who recently completed YI's Young Advocates Internship Program in Texas. She'll share her experience in the labor market leading up to this time and in the uncertain times that we all now face. Christine, I'll turn it over to you for your comments.
Thank you so much, Kyle. Hello, my name is Christine Mompoint. I'm a student at Houston Community College studying political science. Much like other young Americans, it's been such a difficult struggle trying to get involved in the workforce to a way that I can still continue my education. This will be my 5th academic year at a community college, because I'm lacking the resources like job trainings, health insurance, and all these different types of skills that I really need to get a job that is paying me well enough to move out of my parents' house even while I'm trying to finish school. And apart from not having health insurance, it's been just really difficult to keep up with my classes. And so I've had to repeat a ton of classes and try to work with the college as best as I can to attempt to achieve my goals. Recently, around April, I went and decided to look for a job because I felt like that was the cheapest way that I could honestly get health insurance. Knowing the risk as a diabetic, I went and applied at a grocery store. And they, said, we offer our part-time employees insurance. You only have to work a certain number of hours a week. And then 3 weeks into the job, they told me that they'd actually changed their policies in January and that I had been misinformed. And so now I'm putting myself at risk for COVID-19 as somebody who already is high risk, working almost 30 hours a week at this grocery store. And I still don't have the benefits I need to continue school or my job with no problem. At first, I kind of felt uneasy about even bringing that topic up until another coworker told me that she had also been deceived by the same group of people. And so then I realized this was a repeating trend in just trying to get people in the door because the times are so crazy that they want to employ people to keep the grocery stores running during the pandemic. While I understand their need for employees, that's definitely unfair to me. And now I'm putting the rest of my family members who also have diabetes at risk for COVID-19 every day that I come home.
Thanks, Christine, for sharing your story and the challenges that you're facing now. We know that hundreds of thousands and millions of people are encountering similar challenges. Erica, I'd love to turn to you now to think more about the work that you and your colleagues at Jobs for the Future are doing, and how can we have an economic recovery that's really more focused on advancing equity?
Great. Hi, everyone. And thank you so much, Kyle and Young Invincibles, for having me here for this conversation and for hosting this important discussion. And thank you also, Christine, for sharing your story, because we need to hear more stories from folks on the ground, especially for policymakers who are looking to implement solutions for an equitable recovery. So really quickly, as noted, my name is Erica Cuevas. I'm a senior policy manager at Jobs for the Future. JFF is a national nonprofit organization that drives change in our American workforce and education systems to achieve economic advancement for all. And we do this in a variety of ways, and we work with a number of partners in the field, including school districts, community college associations, workforce boards, and employers, just to name a few. We also drive change through policy. So that's where my work comes in, and of that of my colleagues on our policy team. So a little bit about JFF and what we've been up to over the past few months in this era of the COVID-19 crisis. So for us, we know that inequities have existed across our country for generations, as Kyle noted in the intro, and those inequities have only worsened during the COVID-19 crisis. And it was, as a result, policymakers and leaders need to think differently about an economic recovery this time around. It is not about just getting back to normal and back to systems and institutions that were failing far too many people to begin with, especially our young people. We need to think about transforming education and workforce training systems, and also thinking about community revitalization. And that ensuring that no folks are left behind this time, like previous recoveries as well. So if we think about all of the individuals and the millions of folks who've lost their job over the past couple of months due to the crisis, we need a plan for getting them back to work and getting them into good jobs. And we need to think about who really is bearing the brunt of this economic crisis right now. And there are several different challenges happening at the same time that we need to solve for. So one of those challenges is of the jobs that have been lost, some of them actually won't come back. And if they do, they won't come back immediately. Of some of the jobs that were lost, not all of them were good jobs that were providing family sustaining wages and career progression. And also, if we're thinking about those who are working right now that are in frontline positions, like Christine, your frontline position, we need to think about how to provide those individuals with new opportunities and advancement opportunities as well. So the problems that we're facing is not just about getting those who are unemployed into jobs, but it is also ensuring that those who have jobs, that they're good jobs and that they're able to advance in their career and economically. So at JFF, once we saw COVID-19 hit the country and have devastating impacts across education and the workforce, we really focused on shifting a lot of our priorities and putting out insights and thoughts for an equitable economic recovery. So we are taking a multi-pronged approach to this, and I'll quickly talk about the call to action teams that we've put together at JFF. So one of them is specifically focused on building an equitable economic recovery. And this is more policy focused. So just last month, we released an equitable economic recovery policy framework that seeks to influence current policies and investments to help workers and learners, both weather this pandemic, but also in the long term to get on good pathways towards good jobs. And the framework includes 3 key policy pillars, one focused on people, the other one focused on places, and then the third one focused more on transforming systems. Our framework also includes 4 different policy pillars that should guide policymakers when putting together policies for recovery. So I'm happy to talk in more detail about the framework as we go along in the conversation, but that can be found on JFF's website at jff.org. And happy to share as a follow-up to this conversation. So really quickly, the other 4 teams that we put together for an equitable economic recovery focus on, 1, getting the unemployed into good opportunities. So this is more of a regional and industry partnership approach. The next one is about mobilizing corporate leadership and ensuring that they're instituting practices to support employee well-being, security, and economic advancement. Another one is more focused on tech solutions. So how can we think about using technology strategically to enable virtual opportunities, both in learning and in workforce training? And then the last one is about reimagining education and workforce development systems, because we know that those systems have not been serving folks well to begin with and before COVID-19. So let's not just put those back in place, but let's really transform them to meet the needs of today's students, workers, and learners. So that's a little bit about what we've been up to at JFF to ensure an equitable economic recovery, and happy to talk more about those details as we go along. So I'll pass it back to Kyle.
Thanks, Eric. It's such an important point that as we think about going forward, it's not just about, quote unquote, getting back to where we were. It's about how do we honestly recognize what wasn't working and then put new systems in place that don't replicate or even exacerbate the problems that we're trying to work against to begin with. Melissa, I want to transition to you for some comments. You're with the National Skills Coalition, but while like JFF, y'all are doing national work, you're also focused on state strategies, and that brings it down a little bit closer to home. So we'd love to hear your thoughts on the most important things for job training and workplace supports for young people.
Sure. And thank you so much for having me. Thank you, Christine, for kicking us off and centering us in your experience. We are, as our name implies, we are a coalition of advocates, of training providers, of community colleges, businesses, labor, all focused on making sure that workers and industry have the skills that they need to compete and prosper in today's economy. And as we listen to our coalition members, we know that as our economy emerges from this pandemic, it's going to be crucial for workers and people to have a few things that I'll lift up, roughly 4 things. And Erica named a number of things, including transforming systems and making sure that we don't get back to normal, that we actually reimagine what our economy and our workforce is. And I just want to lift those up as well. So the first thing I'll lift up is we need a comprehensive approach to retraining and reemployment. And as part of that, we need to guarantee income, healthcare, training, reemployment for any worker who loses their job specifically for this pandemic. And we know that's especially important for young people because, as you said at the beginning, Kyle, young people are more susceptible to being laid off during recessions. So that's number 1. We also need a safety net. We need work supports that support workers' long-term pathways to skilled careers. So cash assistance, food assistance, healthcare insurance, childcare. Workers need all of that. Working students need all of that. And for far too long, we've made the safety net and these supports too limited in scope because we've made people jump through hoops to get them, like work requirements, and they haven't been open to people participating in training or for education. So we need to definitely reimagine it and strengthen our safety net. 3, we need young people and workers to be included in publicly funded job training efforts. So there's a lot of talk right now about investment in our workforce, our public health infrastructure in particular, and other pieces of our infrastructure. And we need workforce training to be included within that as well. And then finally, I think we all realize in the new kind of virtual environment for training that we need better access to not only digital devices, but digital learning and digital learning skills. Many companies have recently expanded their remote work expectations, their training mechanisms, especially in response to this pandemic. And people need, as I said, not only access to devices, but also the digital literacy skills to meet those expectations of employers. So those are the 4 things I'll just lift up as we start the conversation.
Thanks, Melissa, and that really helps to frame from a policy perspective what we can work on at both a national level, but also in states. And so, Toni, you're in California, and I haven't checked the numbers recently, but at least before the pandemic, California had about a $2.7 trillion GDP, which is, I think, the 5th largest in the world. So it's a huge economy, but we know that there's been some tremendous financial challenges there. Would appreciate hearing from your perspective in the legislature. Kind of give us a sense of what lawmakers and policymakers are looking at, and how this economic situation is affecting different communities or different demographics at a high level in California. I think you just need to unmute yourself.
Is that not a rookie mistake? Thank you very much. I am a policy consultant with the California legislature. Our policy committee looks at issues around economic development, small business development, the workforce needs of businesses. We have been quite active, and in fact, we have an outreach list of about over 200 stakeholder groups that we communicate with twice a week. To try to just keep everybody updated on what are the new programs, what are new rules, where are the studies that we're finding out what groups are being most impacted. And I think the prior speakers did just an excellent job of clearly those people that have been most impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic in the United States are communities of color, particularly communities, Black communities, and in California also Latino communities. We're seeing right now some really very serious community spread within those neighborhoods. One of the things, the roles that our committee plays is just basically briefing members. So one of the things that I've been talking with the members about is basically we have about 18.5 million people in the California labor force. And of that 18.5 million, 3 million are right now classified as officially unemployed. For those of you that follow crazy data stuff, there's actually multiple definitions of unemployment. But for the definition that we're using, we have about 3 million. We also have challenges for keeping public policymakers up because the data lags so significantly. So right now, California can only see our May 2020 data. It's probably going to be about 2 to 3 more days before we can see actually June, and we're already in the middle of July. That's a big impediment, and so that's why having stakeholder groups come forward and really talk about what's happening for their constituencies, whether it's representing a geographic area, is so important. But what we saw for May unemployment is that California was still seeing a decrease in jobs. We lost about 60,000 jobs. that is counter to what we were actually seeing across the nation. Unemployment overall in California was at 16.3%. Again, very much higher than what we were seeing in the realm of the national economy. The largest segment in May was still job losers. And in fact, we're still getting very high numbers on unemployment. As I noted before, we have about 3 million unemployed people in California. Let me compare that to the recession. And the recession at the peak, which we said was in 2009, we had an unemployment level of about 12.9%, and about 1.1 million Californians had lost their job in total. What that means is, in order to address 3 million unemployed, which we don't see that number going to be changing pretty dramatically soon, we really need to have new policies and new activities. Overall, California saw the unemployment rates go down in almost all of the counties. But what we're also seeing is data that we can't yet use. So for instance, believe it or not, the county that had the lowest unemployment in California was actually a pretty rural county of 10%. That was Lassen County. Our urban areas have much higher unemployment levels. But then we're also seeing some higher numbers within our rural areas. Currently, the way we are having the stay-at-home orders, many of our rural areas are still open to some extent, although bars have been closed. But our urban areas are operating pretty much under a stay-at-home order. I want to just give an example. So California is such a large economy. In our prior week, or the week ending July 4th, we were still getting 233,000 new unemployment and pandemic unemployment assistance applications. That is actually up from the prior week. So we are really in kind of a different position as in a lot of other areas. Going forward, there's not much more, I think, clarity. Overall, we believe that it's going to be a pretty short recovery. We're still counting on that, many of our economists. But I think what it really comes down to, and I'm glad that we're having this conversation here, and it's been noted by each of the speakers so much. I think what makes this unique is not just that we are dealing with the COVID-19 pandemic, but that we are also dealing with systemic racism. A lot of the policies that we used in the 2009 recession actually ultimately, whether it was their intention or not, I'm not suggesting people were trying, but because we didn't go back to the core roots of unemployment, the challenges of upward mobility, and come up with something different, we actually saw inequality grow over a period of time. As an example, the research by the Economic Policy Institute tracked this divergence in income inequality in California, looking at 1979 to 2017. So just as we're coming out of the recession. And for the top 0.1%, so that's less than 0.1%, incomes in those households actually increased by 343.2%. Now compare that to what happens to the 90% of all the other households in California, and they actually experienced an increase of only 22%. So we can see, even as the US and California had these long historic economic expansions and even historic unemployment levels as far as being low among Black workers in particular, a deeper dive of the data clearly shows that isn't what's happening. We know that Blacks and Latinx individuals still had unemployment rates in the good times well above what was the statewide average. And as noted by previous speakers, that many of the jobs that that people of color had, and millennials in general, were really low wage and dead end. And what we see in the economic development community is that it's the proliferation of those jobs that clearly is leading to this income inequality. So as we look to go forward, we don't see that income inequality is some unavoidable outcome. We created it. There were public policies that did not address weaknesses, or in many cases, we have to take the responsibility actually reinforced. We have to go back and pull those apart. And I think that we're really seeing that in as the California legislature looks at addressing some things. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Toni, and everyone. And there's certainly a lot for us to chew on over our remaining time here. Eric, maybe I'll turn back to you. You know, both Toni and Melissa, and of course, Christine brought up some really critical points about equity and gaps in our systems. Wanted about your perspective about recognizing there are no, surefire strategies. What are some things that you or your colleagues have identified, whether it's expansion programs or work-based? How can we have more equitable workforce opportunities for young people?
Yeah, that's a great question. Happy to elaborate more on JFF's point of view on this topic. So we really see one effective strategy moving forward is to help more young adults receive the skills and to secure effective and quality employment through opportunities such as work-based learning at both the secondary level, the post-secondary level. That way they can obtain access to good jobs. So work-based learning opportunities, in a nutshell, are opportunities that help young people develop the readiness for the world of work and the knowledge and the skills that support entry and advancement in a particular career field. Ideally, from JFF's perspective, we would see some form of work-based learning happening as early as middle school, definitely in the high school and even in college. And those are just opportunities really to help young people develop their resume, understand what it's like to in the work environment, build up their skills. That way they're better positioned and prepared when they are looking for employment opportunities. Oftentimes when you see job postings, you always see listed an X number of years of experience in a certain area. But for young people, if they're not given those opportunities to build up those experiences or their skills along with academics, then they're already behind, if you will. So one thing that the COVID-19 pandemic, however, has caused is that it's difficult and going to be a little bit more challenging, at least in the near term, to implement and scale work-based learning opportunities because oftentimes work-based learning requires that in-person interaction. And with social distancing, that's going to be tough. But we're really pushing our partners and even policymakers to think about innovative solutions to keep work-based learning in place, help scale it to reach more young people, and think about what could be some tech solutions to get folks that career relevant experience. So a couple of areas that we would like to see expanded more is, of course, in youth apprenticeship, pre-apprenticeship opportunities that lead to pathways to registered apprenticeship and ultimately good paying jobs. I think what's really important is for young people when they're in education and experiencing work-based learning that they're being compensated at the same time. That's very important. Work-based learning can also be a form of an internship also. And then thinking about on the higher ed side, ensuring that there are work-based learning experiences embedded there as well. So we really see that there could be updates to program design, as well as thinking about programs like the Federal Work Study Program, for example. How can we make sure there's equitable access, one, to that program, given that it's has a limited funding pot and there's limited slots available, but how can we direct those slots to the students most in need? And also, how can we ensure federal work study opportunities are more in line with what young people are studying? Again, so they're developing that career relevant, program relevant experience. So that's something we're really hoping policymakers and program stakeholders are looking to implement more, even in this era of social distancing. We still think work-based learning is very, very important.
Thanks, Eric. And I'd like to turn over to Melissa now. We just did a quick poll of our audience to ask them kind of what they see as the biggest challenges for young folks right now. And more than half of them pointed to COVID-related mass unemployment, which Toni discussed in California as being a huge challenge. A lot of the things that we hear about maybe in the press about skills mismatches or even challenges with the gig economy and it not having as robust support system for workers rated as highly by the folks who are tuning in. Would love to hear your thoughts about, given the scale of the unemployment crisis right now, what difference can education and skills training make as buffers or to mitigate the risk of falling into those kind of economic situations, and any other comments you might have about kind of the difference of skills training and education, not just for today's jobs, but what might be in the future that still remains unknown?
So this is a great question. I appreciate this question because this is what we're all dealing with, right? We all know people who have post-secondary education and who are still dealing with unemployment because of the massive scale of unemployment. And we know even within unemployment statistics, there are racial disparities within education levels, and that's worthy of even more time and discussion. So I'll just name that for right now. But we also know that on average, over the long term, people with higher levels of education tend to earn more than people with lower levels of education. That is still true. So education on average is making a difference in income, especially over the long term. At the same time, we have educated people who are unemployed. And I think what gets lost and what we kind of have to unpack in that is that there are a number of factors that are contributing to people being unemployed. There's the lack of worker power. There's the fact that we have such a glut of people who are unemployed and have hit the labor market, and certain business decisions, and they're focusing on the short term that contributes to unemployment. And then finally, you have the huge contributing factor is that the lack of demand in certain sectors, right? Travel, hospitality, tourism, all these sectors that are being heavily affected by social distancing. So when we say there's a skills mismatch issue, we're saying that there are still some industries that are in need of skilled workers right now. So education does make a difference in the long term, and education and training can still make a difference even in the economy that we find ourselves within now. So certain industries, I'm thinking healthcare, like even manufacturing of some PPE, all the people who are keeping us online right now, those particular industries. And so anybody who is underpaid or out of work right now needs to have the opportunity to train for those industries that are hiring even right now. And we've always advocated for sector partnerships so that they can focus on developing specific training strategies targeting the specific needs in certain industries. So yes, skills mismatches exist. Yes, we have certain strategies for kind of addressing those, but we also know that we aren't going to train our way out of this recession. There are a number of other factors at play, but skills training, we recognize, workforce training, higher ed, they are all a very necessary and key piece of us reimagining this economy as we emerge from this pandemic.
Thanks, Melissa and Christine. I saw you kind of nodding along with both Eric and Melissa's comments, but would love to hear your reaction to their comments and to maybe hear a little bit more based on your opening remarks on the experiences you or maybe your classmates have had in striving to get credentials or training, and what your goals might be in terms of entering the workforce and using those credentials on the other side of this tough time we're in right now.
definitely am just so encouraged by all the conversation that's taken place from each of the speakers, just because I think that it's very easy in a world full of all this online information to feel like still things can't change. Like I feel like there's just so much information overload out there that sometimes it gets difficult to see that there's something to hear that there are legislative groups and nonprofit organizations working to improve a lot of the challenges that students face. I think one of the things that really spoke to me in this conversation is about skills equating to the jobs, right? And so like, you know, I have, as a student government officer, there are so many students come to me, hey, Christine, how can I get a job on campus? Like, how can I learn something that I can put on my resume? How can I build this when like the only options are like in the rec sports center and like student life, right? Where we just like throw parties and give out candy. Like, how am I gonna put that on my resume and make it sound like I did something? And then you have like students like me who've been in college for 5 years who, you know, have worked diligently with different groups. I'm a member of the Houston Mayor Student Leadership Alliance, you know, working with legislators, but because I don't have an associate's degree, there are jobs I don't qualify for. And it's such a slap in the face because it's like, where does the skills that you have meet the jobs that you can get, right? And so I definitely think that a lot of panelists are speaking to and the challenges that young adults are facing. I'm glad that it's coming across to these groups well, that there are things that need to be reimagined. And I definitely think that going forward, hopefully more conversations like this will be, you know, had between young adults too, so that way is an opportunity what the workforce can look like.
Thanks, Christine. Your comments make me want to turn to Toni now, and I'm thinking about so much of what states invest in terms of workforce preparation for young people can be career technical education programs, particularly those that are targeted on high school students and then through community colleges or technical training centers. Toni, would love to hear your perspective on either what members of the legislature there are most concerned in terms about those kinds of programs in California, or any thoughts you have on how they might need to be strengthened or reconfigured based on what we're seeing in the economic in California right now.
Thank you. Actually, I've got kind of two different perspectives. One, I probably should have started out. My chair, Assemblymember Sabrina Cervantes, is part of the Millennial Caucus in the legislature. She actually interned with the chair of our committee, the Jobs Committee, as we say by short. So while she may be in the Millennial Caucus, she actually has more experience than any of the members on the committee as far as what economic development does or could do at a public policy level. When she was elected in December of 2016, she made education and training one of her primary goals. Part of that is because of her own experience of having to work her way through UC Riverside and then working within the Western Riverside area after graduation. She was very aware of the economic and educational disparities, which she could see in her own neighborhood as well as across the region. And she also knew that the high school attainment rates, especially among males of color, was particularly low, even as you compared it to the statewide average for California. So one of her early activities was to say, where are the places in this area? The Inland Empire is a very large area in California, and Western Riverside is closest to Los Angeles. And while you may think, well, great, then there must be tons of resources. What she could see was that, well, one, there are a lot of resources. They're difficult to understand. How do you access them? And there's traffic. And a lot of times where the training is, there's not necessarily access from either cheap parking or that there's actually public transit. And how does that fit within the working hours that people on a traditional 9 to 5, or maybe you start at 7 and you're off at 3, but how do you get to those courses? And so one of the early budget actions that she did was to get money for a workforce and training center for the Western Riverside County. It ended up going into, after looking around, it went into Norco Community College. And at that location, they have a wide variety of services, but let me start with more where it is. So they determined the location was good because they had access to public transit. They also have no parking fees. So how many of us have gone to our higher education system, and part of it is where can you park, and then the cost and making sure that you don't run over time and all that. So the location was accessible. People, business owners that were actually wanting to talk to people about getting jobs or talk about what skill sets they might need, as well as students and other members of the community in the process. At the center, they also had access to a person from the state, from the Division of Apprenticeships. So it wasn't just, looking online, but there's actually somebody you could ask direct questions to. It also made sure that the apprenticeship programs that were being offered through the community colleges in the region, the teachers had somebody to go talk to, and that's also very important. They also had social services that were available at that same location. The Riverside County Workforce Board had a presence. So that means we're accessing all of the different WIOA programs, all of them by going into this one location. They also gave room to local chambers of commerce and other nonprofits that had demonstrated that they had the ability to really serve historically underserved populations. They went away from the idea that one size fits all, and they went to try to figure out how do we address the needs of various population groups, making different groups that might have different cultural practices feel comfortable about going to this center. Now, that is something where the funding was actually delivered in 2018, and now we're seeing it expanded. And I'm happy to talk about, some of the accomplishments of it. A lot of them have been around apprenticeship and earn and learn strategies. But now with COVID-19, she's moved to the next level. And this is really looking at regional unemployment and looking at it as skills level. What are the individuals that have lost jobs in this recession? What are the skill sets of the occupations that they were in? And then how does that compare to the skill sets that are necessary to meet the needs of essential businesses and then dominant and emerging industry sectors coming out of the pandemic? All of that has been put together into a pilot project, into a bill called AB 1457. We haven't gone to our first policy committee, but that gives you a little insight on kind of where the chair's actions were. And of course, she's speaking with members of our committee and the broader legislature. But this idea about accessible, multiple resources in a single location, and that allowing that to be relevant to underserved population groups, and literally asking, why don't we see these people here, and how do we make it a good place?
Toni, I'm really struck by how important things that can seem really small or menial can make a huge difference. Your example about just making parking more accessible and how that can be very helpful in these kinds of programs is one that sticks with me. And Erica, I'll turn back to you and taking that point on. We often hear about the sort of big macro ideas, whether it's a Green New Deal or a Workers' Bill of Rights or kind of big systemic changes, and we know that big system changes are needed. And so we understand your thoughts on what's the balance of needing to think about those kind of really tangible sort of everyday needs that people have versus kind of regardless of your thoughts on different policy proposals at sort of the federal level or big changes, how do we make progress, and where do you and your colleagues see the biggest opportunities for change, whether it's in advancing understanding about the really everyday kind of situations that Toni's talked about, or the kind of things that we often talk about here in DC about sort of federal policy?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And I think, from JFS perspective, it's a little bit of both, of ensuring that we're making smaller incremental change, which oftentimes policy can help support, but also really honing in on this moment in time and thinking about bigger transformative changes that can help so many people across the country, and really thinking about systems that have been in place that just no longer make sense and are not serving the populations in most need. So one thing that we're thinking about a lot is, again, going back to all of those who have become unemployed due to the COVID-19 pandemic. Many of them need to get back to work soon, and they're just not going to be able to sit in a traditional 2-year program or in a classroom for 4 years before going back to work. So one big sort of transformational change that JFF would like to see is really rethinking our training approach and our education approach so that it's more accelerated, that there's an efficient pathway to get folks exactly the skills that they need to enter into good jobs, and really almost training to whatever skills gap that an individual may have. So that's one area that we want to see more bigger transformative change, leveraging federal policy and also at the state level as well. Another area that we're thinking a lot about that's more bigger transformative change is being creative in terms of financing for education and skills training opportunities. And we know the policy levers that exist right now, either at the federal level or at the state level, but how can we be even more innovative in helping ensure that folks have the financing that they need to be able to afford these sort of education and retraining opportunities. So whether that's thinking strategically about income share agreements or other ways of financing that's not through the federal loan portfolio, for example, that's really important to us, while balancing ensuring that these opportunities are affordable for folks and that students don't walk away with so much debt that they're not able to pay back their student loans. Other areas, I think those are some areas we're thinking about right now more on the education training side, but it is definitely a mix of the smaller incremental change, the partnerships that we want to see across silos and across systems, but then really lifting our gaze to look more longer term as well.
Thanks, Erica. And I want to remind folks in just a couple of minutes, I want to definitely take our audience questions. And I know we've got at least a couple in the queue, but before we get coming off of Erica's points, Melissa, I'd love to hear your thoughts on what are some exemplar state policies that you or your colleagues have looked at in terms of addressing the issues we're talking about today. What are some kind of, rays of light in kind of a tough time where we can learn more from experience in different states and maybe replicate those successes elsewhere?
Yeah. So there is some hope. There are some rays of light. I'll lift up a few. So in terms of a comprehensive program that is, of course, bolstered and supported by a policy framework for providing career pathways and supports, I think of Arkansas's Career Pathways program and also Pathways to Opportunity in Oregon. Both examples of great career pathways programs that people can start. Arkansas is specifically geared towards parents. They can complete a credential in an in-demand career field and get supports like childcare, transportation assistance, food assistance, get connected to that and all through a coach or a case manager. Arkansas's Career Pathways program is supported through temporary assistance for needy families funding. That's funding that every state gets, but is not directed toward workforce programs in every state. We'd love to see more states use their funding for programs like Arkansas's Career Pathways program to provide more opportunity for people, particularly for people at lower incomes. It's been evaluated, has great outcomes for Black and Latinx students in particular. So that's one example. Oregon, I've mentioned before, also has a Career Pathways program that's supported by SNAP employment and training. And that is an underutilized funding source, once again, that is available to all states that Oregon is leveraging to provide career pathways opportunities and supports for students who are eligible for food assistance. So that's a program, once again, supported by particular policy decisions. That's a good example. Tennessee, I know you're familiar with Tennessee, Kyle, has effectively made community college free. Has that last dollar scholarship and has worked. So that's the big, of course, policy decision that is great in terms of expanding opportunity. But I also think it's great that Tennessee has worked with community ambassadors to target basically certain people from underserved communities to take advantage of their program. So policy decision, yes, and making college free, but also the targeting and the partnerships is a key piece of what I think makes that such a great example as well. So I'll stop there.
Sure, thanks. And as an adopted Tennessean, I appreciate a good call out for what goes on there. Speaking of Tennessee, one of the senators from Tennessee, Lamar Alexander, chairs the Education Committee in the Senate. And one of the things that we're thinking about the most right now in terms of the Senate coming back and thinking about the potential next round of COVID response legislation is what's the right balance of programs and supports for people right now, and also about the CARES Act and some of the things that were put into place in CARES. One of the things that need to be extended to better support people, and knowing that while we're in a pretty spot now, it might take us a while to recover. So help us think through some priorities for advocacy from a federal perspective based on your experiences. And I'd love to get maybe a quick, just maybe two things, maybe from each of you off the top of your head, whether it's student assistance or extended pandemic unemployment assistance or workforce training programs that are more targeted. Where do you see as the biggest needs in terms of the next round of intervention? And be happy if anyone wants to jump in on that. Toni, looks like you were taking notes. So if you have first thoughts, maybe we can go back to you.
Yeah, I think that given the scale and the amount of people that are unemployed and with the stay-at-home orders really coming back and forth, I would say that one of the things that we really need to have in the next bill is we need to deal with income stability. And so I think we need another round of help. It would be very helpful if we could make that income based, or if that does slow down getting the money out, if we instead on the other side had a piece about helping people remember, if you don't need the money, donate it. Here's the local food bank, here's the et cetera. And then the other is workforce training. I think it's going to be a year where we're going to have people that are going to be severely underemployed. I'm hoping we're going to have employment, but it's a real opportunity. So we need income stabilization. We need the $600 maintained for unemployment, and we need to use that, make it reasonable to use the time so people can upskill.
Great, thanks, Toni. Christine, how about you next?
And I think that was very definitely hits head on the nail of what's needed, especially for young adults. I guess my answer is kind of twofold. It's like an answer of what I think would be really helpful, but then also maybe a question that the panel can answer for me is, I guess, training, right? So like, not just training in the sense of skills for the job, but what am I entitled to as an adult on the job? Am I able to ask my employer for some of the basic needs that I have? Is it that only, you know, certain types of employment receive certain types of benefits? Like, what can I ask for, I guess, is the question I would like to pose after concluding the discussion on recommendations.
Sure. Why don't we take a quick pause and get right to Christine's question. If maybe Erica, maybe do you have an answer for her?
Yeah, it is a very, very good question, Christine. And we need to make sure we give our young people and young adults the agency to really speak up, understand what supports are available, and if they're not provided by an employer, for example, directing young people to access to those services because they should be available. And I think the federal government and of course state governments have a role as well to help bridge that gap with social safety net supports that should be strengthened. One thing that JFF of course wants to see would totally second everything Toni said about for the next stimulus bill, what should be some priorities. We agree with those. Other things are more direct support to students, especially those that are in higher education. Another area that's really important to us is continued work and support in expanding access to Wi-Fi and broadband and the devices that people need, both young people, but also older adults who need to access maybe virtual training need to be connected. I think we would argue that access to internet and the devices to get online is actually a basic need in today's age. When we talk about everyone needs food, they need housing, transportation. Well, today everyone also needs, and all families and households need access to internet as well. So I want to see more of that moving forward too.
Thanks, Erica. And I know we've been working on that at YI, and a lot of other groups too have been advocating for several bills that I know are pending in Congress right now that could get folded in terms of making some really historic investments in broadband connectivity, which would be really important. So I'll leave that there and get your thoughts, Melissa, and just remind folks that we're welcome to take your questions as well from the audience.
Sure. So all of these, of course, ideas are great, and I would be remiss if I didn't mention that National Skills Coalition and its leadership of the campaign to invest in America's workforce, of which Young Invincibles is a part, JFF is a part. They've called on Congress to invest $15 billion in the workforce development system in the next stimulus package. So just seconding what Toni started us out with, we need a massive investment in the workforce development system, given the scale of unemployment and the critical piece of where our economy is, the pivot point at where our economy is. And we know through polling that that the public, over 80% of the public actually supports those public investments. So it should be a no-brainer for that massive investment both in the workforce development system so that people can get the skills that they need and also the supports that they need for this changing economy.
Kyle, can I add just something, I'll talk about broadband.
Please.
One of the great ideas, we really need is innovation and people that are willing to just kind of break the mold and say, why not? One of the things we did in California for neighborhoods that didn't have broadband is we took our school buses that are not taking anyone to school and we put broadband on them, and or we put the capability of supporting it. I'm not a tech person. Anyways, we deployed the school buses into neighborhoods. Well, it had two things. One, it allowed access for people that didn't have it. But the other one is it made public policy makers have to identify where are those neighborhoods. So it got away from this concept of, oh, it's a problem, to we don't have it there. So anyways, school buses, broadband, I thought it was kind of cool.
Thanks. Christine, did you have a comment on that?
Yeah, I was just gonna definitely to Erica's point and Tony's point that the internet is such a necessity. So at Houston Community College, we're a minority serving institution, and there are a number of students who had to finish their spring semester on their cell phones or had to sit in the HTC parking lot to do their assignments. And it has kept them so out of the loop. I mean, even as we're running surveys, to feel comfortable to come back to campus, they can't even participate in the survey to let us know what they actually feel because they don't have access to that technology to do it. And so that's definitely been concerning to us as a student organization, and of course the college as a whole, is how do we help students? I mean, they gave away 600 laptops, and then they also took institutional funds to make sure that students could, also get sold every laptop that was available at the school bookstore and mailed it to students. I mean, so it was just such an overwhelming number of students that we were like, wow, that many students actually relied on the library or testing centers to do their assignments. And so it was really a wake-up call for our institution to see really what students were facing, because I think that you don't really know until something like this really dramatic change happens.
That's a really great point, and we know that that's been common all across the country and in urban and rural communities alike in terms of struggling to access. And to that point, we've had a question come in who asks, how does the rural issue factor in? How can we get around genuine job shortages that are irrespective of education and credentials? So I'd love to hear thoughts about rural outreach and rural job situations and education from anyone who might want to take it up.
Well, I'll make some suggestions. So we look very closely at access to broadband. We have significant gaps in California, but we also have speed. So you can be connected, but you can't actually do anything of value. That's been looked at very closely for rural communities, and I have to say that USDA Rural Development has had an initiative around connectivity in the rural communities that for us in California has been very helpful. It also, we're seeing that actually a lot more kind of community, our rural areas are agricultural based, and they have a communitarian value. And so we're actually seeing, in many cases, more creativity, more going in early to say who's missing, who's not here. How do we get people more involved? I would say that some of that activity would benefit if we could get it into the urban areas. Also, our rural areas have a lot less of infection levels, and so in California, they actually are under they're not under stay-at-home orders, et cetera. So that they're essentially also for food are supplying our urban areas.
Yeah, just to quickly jump in on this piece, when we think about job opportunities in rural areas, which can be limited, one thing that JFF is working on and working towards with our partners in rural areas is to think about, when we think about regional economic development in rural areas, is really diversifying the employers and the job opportunities in that area so that there is not a reliance just on one industry. So if we think about Kentucky, for example, that in some areas is heavily relied on coal jobs. Well, if and when those jobs go away, then those individuals don't have somewhere else to go to. But if they diversify the different types of employers that go there and are attracted to bringing jobs there, then that can help those in that area. If they lose their job, they have other opportunities to seek. So really thinking about unique strategies in that space. It's hard work and it's difficult to do, but that's one thing we've been thinking about a lot. And this also connects to work-based learning opportunities. Ideally, you'd have a school district would have a lot of connections with businesses and will be able to place young people to get work experiences across a diverse set of businesses. But in rural areas, that can be difficult if there's just one primary industry in the area. So maybe virtual opportunities in that space could help fill that gap as well.
Yep. And I'll just add here that I think investment in infrastructure is sorely needed in rural areas, right? So going back to Toni's point about investment in broadband solves a number of problems, right? Not only do you get rural communities connected to job opportunities, but if you think about the workforce that's needed to actually lay broadband lines, right? You could actually employ people in jobs that cannot be outsourced, that can be good jobs. So that public investment in infrastructure is something that is like a critical piece of rural economic development and workforce development. And we tend to think of economic development and workforce development together, especially in rural areas, because we need to have people with skills or a certain level of education or access to education in order to attract employers to the area. So thinking about that public investment in the infrastructure to bring all those pieces together.
Thanks to all of you for those responses. And I know we're starting to run a little short on time, but I wanted to pose one question that came in earlier to you, Toni, recognizing that things like Days on the Hill, coming to the legislature to meet with your member aren't really possible right now. What guidance would you give, whether it's to an individual advocate like Christine or to an advocacy group like ours in terms of engaging with your committee and trying to advance some of the kind of ideas we've talked about today?
Thank you. So our committee, what we're doing is we're holding roundtables with our stakeholders. With if you say you want to attend, you can, and we're doing that about every 2 weeks. For offices, if I had wanted to check in with my local assembly member, one of the things I do is I would probably call, because the email accounts that you're seeing publicly, they go into a catch, and then there's somebody who kind of goes through those. So you're actually going to get a faster response if you call the office. And the question would be, who is it in this office that the member, the assembly member, the senator, the House of Representatives, et cetera, has assigned to, and then you fill that in, assigned to workforce development, or assigned to career development for young people. Try to make it a category that's understandable, but narrow enough so that you would actually get connected, because most offices actually assign topics. And then that would be the person that you would ask to meet with. All the offices, we're all have capability of conference calls, at least, if not webinars. But in any time, it's, instead of trying to think of this office as this kind of thing, it's really about people. So who's the person in the office that's supposed to talk to me? And usually when you do that, the person's very excited because it's a topic that they work on regularly, and they probably know a lot of different resources.
Thanks, Toni, for that kind of tangible ways of engagement. And I think this might have to be our last question, but I want to pose it to you, Christine, in terms of coming off Toni's points about from the committee or legislature perspective. What advice or insights do you have that you've taken from your time as an advocate, and what advice might you give for other young people who are looking to be involved and to advocate?
I'd just like to say thank you to all the panelists, just being amongst you and listening to what you do in your communities and what your organizations stand for is really, and I've shared this with the YI team in Houston where I am, but being a part of YI has really made me think about the future and made me really get excited about just wanting to continue my education and being involved in the community, just because for the first time in the 22 years that I've been alive, I felt like healthcare and job and all these things can actually change and they can improve. So one, I feel like if you're losing hope, I would definitely encourage you to join an advocacy program about something that you're passionate about, something that really speaks to you, and you'll find a group of people who are passionate about the same things. I would also encourage you to just really more in my YI internship than I learned like most of the semester. Just because I really dove into our topics and what we were discussing and asked a ton of questions. In high school, whether you're, a much more seasoned adult, it's such an enriching experience because you learn a lot about how the world works and how you are a part of the world. So I would definitely encourage you to join advocacy in some fashion or in some way.
Well, thanks, Christine, and thanks to you as well, Erica and Toni and Melissa. I really appreciate your joining us and your expertise and sharing with us today. I also want to thank everyone who joined us today and took time out of your afternoon to be part of this important conversation. Next week, please join us for the second session of our workforce series. On July 23rd at the same time, we'll address the topic, The American Dream Deferred, Supporting Young Adults' Economic Mobility. We'll tackle issues including racial and wealth inequality, again, which will run throughout this series, as well as different takes on skills mismatches and reentry support for people who have been previously incarcerated. Be sure to register and join us at this same time next Thursday. Finally, a special thanks to our Young Invincibles team who made today's program possible. I want to especially thank Morgan Diamond and Zachary Williams, who were both instrumental in conceiving this program and developing our discussion questions for today. Don't forget to follow us at younginvincibles.org, as well as on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Thanks again to all of our panelists and to each of you, and we look forward to seeing you next week.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.